Chapter 7, Volume 1. For those deplore their doom, whose hope still grovels in his dark sojourn, but lofty souls can look beyond the tomb, can smile at fate and yonder how they mourn. Shall spring at these sad scenes no more return? Is yonder wave the sun's eternal bed? Soon shall the orient with new lustre burn, and spring shall soon her vital influence shed. Again attitude the grove, again adored the mead. Betty, the minstrel. Emily, called as she had requested at an early hour, awoke, little refreshed for the sleep, for uneasy dreams had pursued her and marred the kindest blessing of the unhappy. But when she opened her casement, looked out upon the woods, bright with the morning sun, and inspired the pure air, her mind was soothed. The scene was filled with cheerful freshness which seems to breathe the very spirit of health, and she indeed only sweet and picturesque sound, if such an expression may be allowed, the matin bell of a distant convent, the faint murmur of the sea waves, the song of the birds and the far off low of cattle, which she saw coming slowly on between the trunks of trees, struck with the countenances of imagery around her, she indulged in the pensive tranquillity which they inspired, and while she leaned on her window, waiting till St. Aubert could descend to breakfast, her ideas arranged themselves in the following lines. The first hour of morning. How sweet to wind the forest tangled shade, when early twilight from the eastern bound draws on the sleeping landscape in the glade, and fades as morning spread her blush around. When every infant flower that wept in night, left in chilly heads soft glowing with a tear, expands its tender bosom to the light, and gives its incense to the genial air. How fresh the breeze that wafts with a rich perfume, and swells the melancholy of walking birds, the hum of bees beneath the verdant gloom, and woodman's song and low of distant herds. Then doubtful gleams the mountain's hoary head, seen through the parting foliage from afar, and further still the ocean's misty bed, with frittering sails that partial sunbeams share. But vain the sylvan shade, the breath of May, the voice of music floating on the gale, and forms that beam through morning's dewy well. If heart no longer bid the heart be gay, O balmy hour, this time their well to give, here spread her bless and bid the parent live. Emily now heard persons moving below in the cottage, and presently the voice of Michael, who was talking to his mules, as he had led them forth from a herd adjoining. As she left her room, St. Aubert, who was now risen, met her at the door, apparently as little restored by the sleep as herself. She led him downstairs to the little parlour in which they had suppered on the preceding night, where they found a neat breakfast set out, while the host and her daughter waited to bid them good morrow. I envy you this cottage, my dear friends, said Aubert, as he met them. It is so pleasant, so quiet, so neat, and this air that one breathes, if anything could restore lost health, it would surely be this air. Lavassin bowed gratefully and replied with the gallantry of a Frenchman. Our cottage may be envied, sir, since you and mademoiselle have honoured it with your presence. St. Aubert gave him a friendly smile of his compliment and sat down at the table spread with cream, fruit, new cheese, butter, and coffee. Emily, who had observed her father with attention and thought he looked very ill, endeavoured to persuade him to defer travelling till the afternoon, but he seemed very anxious to be at home, and his anxiety expressed repeatedly with his earnestness, which was unusual with him. He now said he found himself as well as he had been of late, and that he could bear travelling better in cool hour of the morning than any other. But while he was talking with his venerable host and thanking him for his kind attentions, Emily observed his countenance change, and before she could reach him, he fell back in his chair. In a few moments he recovered. from the sudden faintness that had come over him, but felt so ill that he perceived himself unable to set out, and having remained a little while, struggling against the pressure of indisposition, he begged he might be helped upstairs to bed. This request renounced all the terror that enemy has suffered on the preceding evening, but though scarcely able to support herself under the sudden shock it gave her, she tried to conceal her apprehensions from St. Aubert, and gave her trembling arm to assist him to the door of his chamber. When he was once more in bed, he desired that Emily, who was then weeping in her own room, might be called, and that she came. He waved her hand on her for every person to quit the apartment. While they were alone, he held out his hand on her and fixed his eyes upon her countenance with an expression so full of tenderness and grief that all her fortitude forsook her, and she burst into an agony of tears. St. Aubert seemed struggling to acquire firmness, which was still unable to speak. She could only press her hand check the firmness and check the tears that stood trembling in his eyes. At length he commanded his voice. "My dear child," said he, trying to smile within his anguish, "my dear Emily." He paused again. He raised his eyes to the heaven as if in prayer, and then in a firmer tone, with a look in which the tenderness of his child was dignified with the pious solemnity of the saint, he said, "My dear child, I would soften the painful truth I have to tell you, but I find myself quite unequal to the art. Alas, I would at this moment conceal it from you, that it would have been most cruel to deceive you. I cannot be long before that we must part. Let us talk of our thoughts and our prayers must prepare to bear it." His voice faltered, and Emily, still weeping, pressed his hand close to her heart, which swelled with a convulsion sigh, and she could not look up. "Let me not wait this moment," said St. Aubert, recovering himself. "I have much to say. There is a circumstance of the solemn consequence which I have to mention, and a solemn promise to obtain from you. When this is done, I shall be easier. You have observed, my dear, how anxious I am to reach home, and know not at all the reason for this. Listen to what I am going to say. Yet stay before I give me this promise, a promise made to your dying father." St. Aubert was interrupted. Emily struck his last word as if for the first time it was the conviction of his immediate danger, raised her head, her tears stopped, gazing at him for a moment with an expression of unattainable anguish. A slight convulsion seized her, and she sunk senseless in her chair. St. Aubert cries brought Lavoisier and his daughter to the room, and they administered every means to their power to restore her, but it was a considerable time without effect. She recovered. St. Aubert was so exhausted by the scene he had visited that it was many minutes before he strengthened to speak. He was, however, somewhat revived by a cordial which Emily gave him, and being again alone with her, he exercised himself to tranquilize her spirits and to offer her the comfort of which her situation admitted. She threw herself into his arms, wept on her neck, and grief made her insensible to all she said. Then she ceased to offer the alleviations which he himself could not at this moment feel, and mingled his silent tears with her. Recalled at length to the sense of duty, she tried to spare her father from the further view of her suffering, and quitting his embrace dried her tears and said something which she meant for consolation. "My dear Emily," replied St. Aubert, "my dear child, we must look up with humble confidence to that being which has protected us and comforted us in every danger and in every afflictions we have known, to whose eyes every moment of our lives has been exposed. He will not, he does not forsake us now. I feel his consolations in my heart. I shall leave you, my child, still in his care, and though I depart from this world, I shall be still in his presence. Nay, weep not, my Emily. In death there is nothing new or surprising, since we all knew that we are born to die, and nothing terrible to those who can confide in an all-powerful God. Had my life been spared now, after a few years in the course of nature, I must have resigned it. Old age, with all its strain of infirmity, its privations and its sorrows, which have been now mine. And then at last death would have come, and called forth the tears you now shed. Rather, my child, rejoice that I am saved from such suffering, that I am permitted to die with a mind unimpaired and sensible of comforts of faith and of resignation. St. Alfred paused, fatigued with speaking. Emily again endeavoured to assume an air of composure, and in replying to what he had said, tried to soothe him with a belief that he had not spoken in vain. Then, when he reposed in a while, he resumed the conversation. "Let me return," he said, "to a subject which is far near my heart. I said I had a solemn promise to receive from you. Let me receive it now, before I explain the chief circumstance which it concerns. There are others of which your peace requires that you would rest in ignorance. Promise, then, that you will perform exactly as I said, enjoin." Emily, awed by the earnestly solemnity of his manner, dried her tears, then had begun again to flow, in spite of her efforts to suppress them, and looking eloquently at St. Aubert, bound herself to do whatever he should require by a vow at which she shuddered, yet knew not why. He proceeded, "I know you too well, my Emily, to believe that you would break any promise, much less one thus solemnly given. Your assurance give me peace, and the observance of it in the utmost importance of your tranquillity. Hear then what I am going to tell you. The closet which adjoins my chamber at La Vallée has a sliding board in the floor. You will know it by a remarkable knot in the wood, and by its bearing in the next board, except when at the vein course which affronts the door. At the distance of about a yard from the end, nearer the window, you will perceive a line cross it, as if the plank had been joined. The way it opened is, press your foot upon the line, the end of the board will then sink. You may slide it with ease beneath the other. Below you will see a hollow space." St. Aubert paused for breath, and Emily sat fixed in the deep attention. "Do you understand these directions, my dear?" said he. Emily, though scarcely able to speak, assured him that she did. "When you return home, then," he added with a deep sigh. At the mention of a return home, all the melancholy circumstance that must attend this return rushed upon her fancy, and she burst into a convulsive grief, and St. Aubert himself, affected beyond the resistance of the fortitude which he had at first summoned, wept with her. After a few moments he composed himself. "My dear child," said he, "be comforted when I am gone. You will not be forsaken. I leave you only to the more immediate care of the Providence which has never yet forsaken me. Do not afflict me with this excess of grief, rather teach me by your example to bear my own." He stopped again, and Emily, that much more endeavoured to restrain her emotion, found it the less possible to do. St. Aubert, who was now spoke with plain, resumed the subject. "That closet, my dear, when you return home, go on it, and beneath the board I have described, you will find a packet of written papers. Attend to me now, for the promise you have particularly given relates to what I shall direct. These papers you must burn, and solemnly I command you, without examining them." Emily's surprise for a moment overcame her tears. She ventured to ask why this must be. St. Aubert replied if it had been right for him to explain these reasons, her late promise would have been unnecessarily extracted. "Is this sufficient for you, my love, to have a deep sense of importance of observing me in this instance?" St. Aubert proceeded. "Under that board you will also find 200 last orders wrapped in a silk purse. Indeed, it was to secure whenever money might be in the chateau at this secret place which contrived at a time which the province were overrun by the troops of men who took advantage of the tumults and became plunderers. But I have yet another promise to receive from you, which is that you will never, whatever may the future circumstances, sell the chateau." St. Aubert had even enjoined her, whenever she might marry, to make an article in the contract that the chateau should always be hers. He then gave her a more minute account of his present circumstances that he had yet done, adding, "The 200 lions that with what money you will now find in my purse is already money I have to leave you. I have told you that how my circumstance with M. Motteville at Paris. Ah, my child, I leave you poor, but not destitute," he added after a long pause. Emily could make no reply to anything he now said, and knelt at the bedside with her face upon the quilt, weeping over the hand he had held there. After this conversation, the mind of St. Aubert appeared to be much more at ease, and but exhausted at the effort of the speaking, he sunk into a kind of doze, and Emily continued to watch and weep beside him, till a gentle tap of the chamber door roused her. It was La Voisin came to see that a confessor from the neighbourhood convent was below, ready to attend St. Aubert. Emily would not suffer her father to be disturbed, but desired that the priest might not leave the cottage. When St. Aubert woke from his doze, his senses were confused, and it was some moment before he recovered them sufficiently to know that it was Emily who sat beside them. He then moved his lips and stretched forth his hand to her, and that he received, which she sunk back in her chair, overcome by the impression of the death of his countenance. By a few minutes he received his voice, and Emily then asked if he wished to see the confessor. He replied that he did, and when the Holy Father appeared, she withdrew. They remained alone together about half an hour. When Emily was called in, she found St. Aubert more agitated than when he had left him, and she gazed at the slight degree of resentment at the farrier as the cause of this, who however looked mildly and mournfully at her and turned away. St. Aubert in a tremulous voice said he wished her to join in the prayer with him, asked if La Voisin would do so. The old man and his daughter both wept, and knelt at Emily round her bed, while the Holy Father read the solemn voice the service for dying. St. Aubert lay with a serene countenance and seemed to join fervently in the devotion, while tears stole from beneath his closed eyelids, and Emily sobbed more than once interrupted the service. When it was concluded, the extreme auction had been administered and the farrier withdrew. St. Aubert made a sign for La Voisin to come nearer. He gave him his hand and was for a moment silent. At length he said in a trembling voice, "My dear good friend, our acquaintance has been short but long enough to give you an opportunity of showing me much more kind attention. I cannot doubt that you will extend your kindness to my daughter when I am gone. She will have need of it. I entrust her to your care during the few days that she'll remain here. I need say no more. You know the feelings of a father for you have child. Mine would be, indeed, severe if you have less confidence to you." He paused. La Voisin assured him, and his tears bore testimony to his sincerity, that he would do all that he could to soften her affliction, and that if he, St. Aubert, wished it, he would even attend her into the Gascony to offer to the pleasing St. Aubert that he had scarcely words to acknowledge his sense of the old man's kindness, or to tell him that he accepted it. The scene that followed between St. Aubert and Emily affected La Voisin so much that he quitted the chamber, and she was again left alone with her father, whose spirit seemed fainting fast, but neither his senses or his voice yet failed him, and at intervals he employed much of his last awful moments in advising his daughter as to the future conduct. Perhaps he never had thought more justly or expressed himself more clearly than he did now. "Above all, my dear Emily," said he, "do not indulge in the pride of fine feeling, the romantic error of amiable minds. Those who really possess sensibility ought early to be taught that it is dangerous quality, which is continually extracting the excess of misery or delight from every surrounding countenance. Thence each in our passage than our world painful circumstances occur more frequently than pleasing ones, and since our sense of evil is, I fear, more acute than our sense of good, we become the victims of our feelings, unless we in some degree command them. I know you will say, for you are young, my Emily, I know you will say that you have an contempt sometimes to suffer, rather than to give up to your refined sense of happiness at others, but when your mind has been long harassed by vicissitude, you will be content to rest, and you will then recover from your delusion. You will perceive that the phantom of the happiness is exchanged for the subject, and the substance for the happiness arises in the state of peace, not of tumult. It is of temperate and uniform nature that no more exists in a heart than is continually alive to minute circumstance than in one to it is dead to feeling. You see, my dear, that though I would guard you against the dangers of sensibility, I am not an advocate for apathy. At your age, I said that there is a vice more hateful than all the errors of sensibility, and I shall say so still. I call it vice because it leads to positive evil. In this, however, it does no more than an ill-governed sensibility, which by which a rule might also be called a vice, but the evil of a former is of more general consequence. I have exhausted myself, St. Aubert feebly said, and have wearied you, my Emily, but on a subject so important to your future comfort, I am anxious to be perfectly understood. Emily assured him that his advice was most precious to her and that she would never forget it or cease from endeavouring to profit from it. St. Aubert smiled affectionately and sorrowfully upon him. I repeated, said it, I would not teach you to become insensible if I would. I would only warn you of my evil susceptibility and point out how you may avoid them. Beware, my love, I conjure you, of the self-delusion which has been fatal to the peace of so many persons, and beware of priding yourself on the gracefulness of sensibility. If you yield to this vanity, your happiness is lost forever. Always remember how much more valuable is the strength of fortitude than the grace of sensibility. Do not, however, confine fortitude with apathy. Apathy cannot know the virtue. Remember too that the act of beneficence, one act of real usefulness, is worth all the abstract sentiments in the world. Sentiment is a disgrace, instead of an ornament, unless it leads us to the good actions. The miser who thinks himself respectable merely because he possesses wealth and thus mistakes the means of doing good for the actual accomplishment of it. It is not more blamable than the man of sentiment whose active virtue. You may have observed persons who delight so much in the sort of sensibility to sentiment, whose excludes when the calls of any practical virtue, that they turn from the distressed, and because their sufferings are painful to be contemplated, they do not endeavour to relieve them. How despicable that is to the humanity, which can be countenanced to the pity where it is most assuaged. St. Aubert some time after spoke of Madame Sharon, his sister. "Let me inform you of a circumstance that nearly affects your welfare," he added. "We have known that a little intercourse from the New Year's, but that she is your only female relation. I have thought it proper to consign you to her care, as she will see in my will till you are of age, and to recommend you to her protection afterwards. She is not exactly the person to whom I would have committed my Emily, but I have no alternative. I believe her to be upon the whole a good kind of a woman. I need not recommend it to your prudence, my love, to endeavour to conciliate her kindness. You will do this for his sake, who has often wished to do it for yours." Emily assured him that whatever he requested she would religiously perform at the utmost of her ability. "Alas," she added, in a voice interrupted by sighs, "that will soon be which remains of him. It will be almost my only consolation to fulfil your wishes." St. Aubert looked up silently at her face, as if he would have spoken, but his spirit sunk in a while, and his eyes became heavy and chill. She felt the look at her heart. "My dear father," she exclaimed, and then checking herself pressed his hand closer and hid her face with a handkerchief. Her tears were concealed, and St. Aubert held her convulsive sobs. His spirits returned. "Oh, my child," said he faintly, "let my consolations be yours. I die in peace, for I know that I am about to return to the bosom of my father, who will still be know that I am to return to the bosom of my father, who will still be your father when I am gone. Always trust in him, my love, and he will support you in this moment as he supports me." Emily could only listen and weep to the extreme composure of his manner, and faith and hope he expressed somewhat soothed her anguish. Yet whatever she looked upon his emaciated countenance, and saw the lines of death beginning to prevail over, saw his eyes sunk, still bent on her, and their heavy eyelids pressing to a close, there was a pang in her heart, such as defied expression, though it required filial virtue like hers to forbear the attempt. He desired once more to bless her. "Where are you, my dear?" said he, as he stretched forth his hand. Emily has turned to window that he might not perceive her anguish. She now understood that his fight had failed him. When he has given her his blessing, and it seemed to be the last effort of expiring life, he sunk back on his pillow. She kissed him in the foreheads. The damps of the death had settled there, and forgetting her fortitude for a moment, her tears mingled with them. St. Aubert lifted up his eyes. The spirit of the father returned to them, but it quickly vanished, and he spoke no more. St. Aubert lingered till about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and thus gradually sinking into death, he expired without a struggle or a sigh. Emily was led into the chamber by Lavoisier and his daughter, who did what they could to comfort her. The old man sat and wept with her. Agnes was more erroneously officious.